Aloha! Welcome to the Sovereignty Conversations, a new discussion about sovereignty and where we're going with this movement. We're looking forward to talking to you on a monthly basis about not only thoughts around sovereignty, but talking to different sovereignty thought leaders about what sovereignty looks like to them and what it means to you. Native Hawaiians are asking questions all the time about sovereignty, and we're hoping that this conversation will help inform and keep you up to date on what sovereignty can look like from different points of view. I'm Maile Alau. I'm the Executive Director of Hawaii Maoli. We're most well known as the nonprofit partner of the Association of Hawaiian Civic Clubs, but our mission really is to support all Kanaka Maoli communities and to hold a neutral space. So this conversation is designed to be a neutral one. Bring your opinions, everyone is welcome, all viewpoints are welcome as long as they're in support of Kanaka Maoli communities. So we look forward to sharing this with you over the next half hour. We hope that you'll sit down with perhaps with your ohana and listen to the sovereignty conversation. This is our very first show, so I'm very excited that we get to start this show with history and some framing. We all sort of have different views of what's happened so far, and I, for one, do not have a lot of education around what sovereignty has looked like up until this moment. So I'm looking forward to having a conversation with our two guests today. We have Dr. Lynette Cruz from Hawaii Pacific University. Thanks for joining us, Lynette.
Thank you for having me.
And Makana Paris, who is the Vice President of the Student Bar Association at Richardson School of Law.
Mahalo, thank you.
Mahalo. So to get started, I thought we might start with just a timeline, because we've all know sort of the dates around different events that happened in Hawaii history. And I'm going to tell you that the timeline that I'm going to give you is something that you might typically read on the internet or even in the school system. So there's lots of different ways to think about each individual event. But what I'm going from is just something that you might typically find if you were to Google Native Hawaiian timeline in terms of Hawaiian history. So in 1778, Englishman James Cook of the British Navy arrives in Hawaii. In 1795, the Hawaiian Islands are unified under Kamehameha the Great. In 1819, Kamehameha the Great dies, and his son Liholiho becomes Kamehameha II and abolishes the kapu system. Hawaii adopted their first constitution in 1840. In 1842, our first House of Representatives was called to order. 1886, King Kalakaua comes into power. We all know him as the Merry Monarch. Also, the Kamehameha schools are founded. In 1891, King Kalakaua passed away, and Queen Liliuokalani becomes queen. And in 1893, Queen Liliuokalani surrendered the Kingdom of Hawaii to the United States under protest. In 1898, Hawaii was annexed to the United States, and in 1900, Hawaii became a U.S. territory. In 1934, President Roosevelt was the first U.S. president to visit Hawaii. And in 1959, Hawaii became the 50th state on August 21st, 1959. So in terms of historical timeline, that's what you might see if you were just looking for that information. And it's probably what our kids are being taught in schools at this point. So with all of that, especially in Queen Liliuokalani surrendering the kingdom to the United States under protest to avoid bloodshed, that moment right there causes this conversation today, because the sovereignty of the Kingdom of Hawaii was never relinquished. And the sovereignty movement, which we've all come to hear there over the last 20, 30, however many years, I'm not wise enough to give you the years, has been around for a long time. So I'm going to ask Dr. Cruz to tell us a little bit about the background of the sovereignty movement.
I can tell you what I think is the background of the movement.
That would be great.
And I think there are multiple understandings of how things begin, but my dissertation actually covered a bunch of this stuff. And of course, it was crap as soon as it was written, but who cares? Yeah, so at the time, it was something that I had to do, but since then, of course, I found out a lot more information, and it's a bit more complex than that. Let me just say that, and the question people always ask me is, why is there even a movement? Because I was teaching this at HPU, and why are Hawaiians involved in something like this? It's an interesting question, and for me, forced me to actually go look. So at one point in time, you have a civil rights movement happening in the United States, and you have the American Indian movement, and you have a bunch of Native peoples everywhere, certainly within the United States, protesting against what they feel is unfair treatment by the United States government. And then you also have, at the same time, people from Hawaii who are going away to college and learning about stuff and realizing that the things that they're finding out about are very similar to what's going on in Hawaii. These ideas come home, and people begin to see that, hey, the almost synonymous. The parallels are outstanding. I mean, we're them, they're us. And so a huge kind of a push towards research to find out exactly what is our history, you know, how much like them are we? And so you see all of this stuff happening, and just the Hawaiian community, people of Hawaiian ancestry, trying to figure out who are we? Because, you know, the big question all the time is, if you don't know who you are, how will you know where you're going? Where do you want to go? You got to figure out where you've been. So I think what is significant is, well, several things. One, I think 1976, the first graduating class at UH Richardson Law School, you got a bunch of Hawaiians who are looking at issues of land. What about our land? You know, who owns this land, and how is it that the land is being taken, it's being sold? You know, what are the laws that relate to our own land? So you have that happening. And at the same time, you have other things going on, like militarization of the land. And so a quarter of the land belongs somehow to the military. And you have struggles going on at Makua, on Oahu, at Pohakuloa, Kaho'olawe, all of these areas. And then shortly thereafter, you have the University of Hawaii engaging in a lot of contractual agreements with the Department of Defense, and basically turning into a research and development kind of university. So you have this, you have development, the lands that are being used while Hawaiians are homeless and living on the beach, and people are asking themselves, how come in your homeland, it's your people that are living on the beach, and all the other people who come here somehow own land, have the best jobs, have education, their kids are going to the best schools. What the heck is going on? So these kinds of questions are coming up, and I would say over like a 20 or 30-year period, the same questions keep coming up, and people begin to look at our history. And you have like the first graduating class, I think, or Hawaiian language program begins in the late 70s, and you have people who are using Hawaiian language newspapers for their research and finding out by reading those papers, hey, all this stuff that we learned in school, whose history was that? It's not ours. And so you have more and more information coming forth, and all of a sudden, you have this push for sovereignty. You know, I think Kalahui started in in the 80s, 1980s. So you have Kaho'olawe, then you have a constitutional convention in 78, you have Office of Hawaiian Affairs in 1980, and people like Mel Kalahiki, who were around at that time, actually have all these stories to tell, because even then they were unsure what they wanted. They wanted what the Indians wanted, because they didn't know what our history was. Well, fast forward 20 years, by the year 1994, 1995, Noenoe Silva does her research on whether or not, what happened at the time of the overthrow? What were people doing? Did everybody say it's okay in our history books? You have actually some stories about how the Queen was just so happy to give it over. And she finds out that's not true. There was protests everywhere, and finds these petitions that everybody knew existed but never saw, and brings them back to Hawaii. And
Auntie, what was the name of the petitions?
The Ku'e petitions. Well, we call them the Ku'e petitions. Basically, it was like, no way, we don't want to be part of the United States. Well, all of this is news, you know, to the general public, certainly news to Hawaiians, and nobody really knows how to deal with this stuff. And at the same time, you have Perfect Title Company that's coming up and challenging land titles in Hawaii. And you have people like Keanu saying they're doing other kinds of research that does not rely on an American perspective of history. And all of a sudden, people begin to see that we have been taught just a lot of made-up history, revised history. And I think that set us off on a path to actually find out who we are and where we came from. That's still ongoing. So now when we talk about sovereignty and we talk about self-determination, one of the things I realize is that those terms are not synonymous. Sovereignty is really independence. Self-determination is what federal recognition offers, self-determination. So we have this big split, but when you talk with people about it, they use them together. You can have this or this in one conversation, and we actually are going for the same thing. It's very confusing. Confuses even me. And that means that I'm not always sure how to engage in a discussion with somebody because we have not agreed on how the terms are to be used. I think Makana probably has a lot more to say about that than I do.
Absolutely, because you bring up two very particular terms, which is sovereignty and self-determination. And right now, if we use like a more Western definition, we're talking about the absolute control over one's own territory.
So that's the word sovereignty?
Sovereignty
absolute
itself.
control over one's own territory.
Yes, so
Okay.
that in and of itself like bodes like Western connotations. Like what I like to analogize for our own community is like, where is our values? And if we want to conceptualize sovereignty from a Hawaiian perspective, then let's talk about our kuleana to the aina, our relationship to the land and the natural resources that we have kin relationship with. So starting there actually starts to frame the conversation differently, as opposed to who has control, as opposed to who has responsibility.
I love that.
Now, when we talk about self-determination, if we're using the Western frames of sovereignty and the different models that come from it, self-determination leads us to like just different ways of actualizing more and more control over one's territory and natural resources within those bounds. And you can have different levels. And when you want to go there, we can definitely talk about that.
So when you're talking about
You need an hour. Serious.
we only have half hour. So, so self-determination. So this is a term that I hear a lot, and I'm going to operate in from the point of view that like I don't get it, I don't understand it. So self-determination sounds like it has the option to start off on one level and then grow. Is that right?
Absolutely, because ultimately, if we reframe again from a Hawaiian perspective, the self-determination is our own recognition of ourselves in the spectrum of our ancestors and those that will come after us, recognizing our kupuna and our pio and the aina. And self-determination is us first recognizing who we are, and then recognizing that Hawaiians are not the only people on this planet having this conversation. So we have to then, because we are honoring these other people groups across the planet, have to start creating a common syntax to engage with them. So self-determination is really us saying, this is who we are, this is how we want to operate first within our own lahui, within our own ohana, within our own group, and then this is how we would like to relate to the rest of you. Emphasis on self.
Yeah, that makes sense. So I want to come back to Dr. Cruz for a second, only because it sounds like there was a tipping point for Native Hawaiians, as much as there were for other Native peoples across the United States. You know, you sort of have a tipping point of enough education, enough people who are spending time on the continent and in Hawaii, a resurgence of the Hawaiian language, which led people to be able to access more information than they had before. So when you're talking, so this tipping point happens, yeah? And it goes from being, well, this is what we've been told, and this is what we understand, to, oh, that's what we've been told and understand, but this is what is. And I mean, from your perspective, is that kind of what really tipped the barrel for the sovereignty movement?
Well, a lot of the information that's coming to us is coming out of documents that are old. So we didn't have to make
Absolutely.
any of that stuff up.
Yeah.
And what happens when you access old newspapers and you see what people actually said, what they wrote, all of a sudden the way you feel about your ancestors changes, because you know they took a particular position. It really behooves me to figure out what was going on. And then the rest of the documents, which might be called legal documents, actually come out of, say, the United States National Archive or other places, and it tells us their story relative to us, which is not very pleasant. It's not a good story. However, this is history. I mean, so these things actually happen. And I think what happens to those of us who knew nothing and then all of a sudden we have a little bit of information is it causes us to rethink every single thing. Let me give you an example. a couple weeks ago, there was an article, there was a news story on Channel 4 about the McKinley statue. I don't know if anybody caught it. It was just
Yeah.
a very short
It's a
thing.
little small thing, yeah.
And they interviewed Ken Asai, and he's talking about the document that's in the hand of McKinley statue that says Treaty of Annexation, when we know very well there was no such document. And so he didn't really go very much into it, but shortly after that they interviewed the principal of the school, who happened to be a history major, who said something like this, I'm paraphrasing, history is history, you can't change it. Now for me, that makes absolutely no sense, because it's not history. It really isn't. It's something that people were taught that was incorrect. Couldn't prove it. We can prove it. We can prove that what you're saying and what actually happened didn't. You know, it's not true. So actually, history as we understand it can change. Just be brought up to date. But when you do that, everything else changes too. So there's this whole domino effect. And I think what has happened in the community is people are beginning to see, you start tinkering with one thing, everything falls down. But you know what I like to remind people, it's not our fault. It really isn't.
Well, and history is written, I mean, it's always been this way. History is written by the victors. History is not written by the people who lost in that game. It's written by the people who run the game. So it's not surprising that history is not, it's not. And then what I find it really funny is that the frame is that we're changing history. It's like, no, we're not changing history. We're just revealing what actually happened, what actual history is, as opposed to what we've been taught.
True. You know, when we're talking about history changing, a lot of times when I hear people talk about sovereignty in our community, they're framing it in this conception that there's the modern nation state and the rise thereof, which is a fairly modern invention. It didn't exist over really 100 years ago, or maybe 200 years ago. Historians will argue. But the beautiful thing about it is that our ancestors in the kingdom, they established a relationship with the family of nations and obtained international recognition from their peers and became the first non-European country to be recognized as a foreign sovereign. So they joined the family. And that was the case all the way up to 1893. We had legations across the world and treaties with all of the major countries, including Belgium and the United States and Italy, the Netherlands. And so many of us that are reclaiming that particular part of our history focus on that particular time frame's understanding of sovereignty, which is sovereignty as absolute territorial control over one's own nation and national boundaries. Because they were trying to figure that out then. They were trying to see who could have what, where, what do we do with people within our boundaries that we like or don't like. Those type of questions were then actually answered in the subsequent years after our community established independence. Now, the beautiful thing is that here's this community of Native Hawaiians and our allies that recognize the new political reality and realize that our system of operating under the Aikapu system does not work. Not it doesn't work for Kanaka. It doesn't work for all of the people coming over here, because they don't understand those frames. They don't understand our natural resource laws in the Aikapu system. They don't understand how certain things will be damaged in our social fabric if they disobey. And to be honest, they weren't able to be held accountable, because what would happen if they broke an Aikapu law? They would actually just jump on a ship and run away. So our ancestors had the task of thinking, how are we going to stay true to our values, recognizing our kuleana to the next generation, and try to hybridize into this new modern system. And that's where, for me, Auntie, the conversation of the sovereignty movement actually started when we engage other peoples. When we realized as a people group that we started to recognize that there's other societies out there that we need to have a conversation and create this common language. So what we're doing today is kind of like what they were doing back then, and almost just stopped around 1893 and went underground for a period of time during the illegal occupation. Because it is definitely arguable under international and United States constitutional law that the state of Hawaii does not exist, because the federal government is illegally occupying these lands. Now, given that, we still have to deal with the political reality of what's going on around us. We have banks that recognize the state, we have notary publics, it's like we have the counties that exist on the authority of the state. So we have to deal with these things that we all know and see. But the funny part about it is that this whole EHA, the problem that came about, wasn't your fault, wasn't our fault, wasn't the United States of America's current citizens' fault. Like, somebody will mess up back then. And we're dealing with the funkiness that never get actually untwined. So I believe that it's really our generation and our responsibility to try and untwine the craziness that happened and then make some sense of it and move forward in a Pono way. And that's where I believe the sovereignty conversation ought to head. It's like, how do we help each other untwine the messed upness that none of us really actually created, but we all have responsibility too, if we actually want to call Hawaii our home.
Agreed.
There's some fixing that needs to be done.
That's
and
right.
I remember talking with Poka, who I hope will be a guest one of these days, but his thing was, everybody in Hawaii knows that there's something wrong.
Absolutely.
They haven't been able to put a name to it, but everybody knows it, when they all pretend that we should just go on with our lives because there's nothing we can do about it. But the reality is that the something wrong is felt more strongly by one particular group, and that's us,
That's Hawaii.
which behooves us to move it, fix it, because we cannot be the thing that is we're the ones that have something wrong. And this whole thing about being at the bottom of every social industry, every single one in our home, in our house, that is not a good thing. So sometimes when people ask me, well, what about sovereignty? Why are you guys doing this? And I point at that.
Yeah.
Because that doesn't work.
So it sounds like we have a lot to talk about for the sovereignty conversations. But here we've got a history and a bit of a framework that basically tell us that these conversations are, one, important, and two, I'm not the only one who's confused. I mean, even people who are professors, people who are law students, you folks have the education to sit here and pull it apart. I think it behooves us and it behooves these conversations to be able to help others pull that apart and untwine the messed upness. I like that. I'm going to use it. So we look forward to the next sovereignty conversation to help continue to untwine the messed upness. As we're about to wrap up here, any final thoughts, Dr. Cruz?
I think it's our kuleana, just as you say. The information is not to be delivered to you. You got to come and ferret it out. You got to figure out what to do because you got family, and it's your kuleana to pass that on.
Makana?
My final thought is really one of gratitude. I wanted to mahalo like all of those that have come before us that actually have laid the foundations for us to be able to discover and have this conversation today. And mahalo all of our elders that's still with us that actually did some heavy hitting and going into different explorations of ways of trying to figure out what this means for our community. Because they laid the groundwork for law students like myself and those that will come after to be able to actually now see from our own community's perspective what's really going on.
Maikai. Mahalo, Dr. Cruz, Makana, thank you for joining us for the sovereignty conversation. We hope that you'll be joining us monthly as we continue to untwine the messed upness.
Okay, just made up some new words.
Yeah,
I know.
we made them new up.
We're just going to make up, it sounds like we need to make up a new framework anyway on how this is going to work. But we hope that you'll join us every month as we talk about this. One of the things that Dr. Cruz did share was this idea that there are lots of thoughts around what sovereignty is going to look like or what it might look like. And I think we've all watched enough news channels and we've read enough on the internet to be sufficiently confused by the number of different ways that people think about it. Some folks are firmly and comfortably in the thought of, I don't think anything's wrong and I'm happy with the way things are proceeding and I'm good with this. All the way to the perspective of Hawaiians in Hawaii and no one else, which doesn't work well for me. My mother is not Hawaiian and I'd like her to stay. So these are the kinds of things that whole gamut are the conversations that we need to have, and that we hope that you folks will join us for to learn for yourselves and for your ohana how to figure out what sovereignty is and what it looks like and how to have that conversation in your own home. So we look forward to seeing you next month on Sovereignty Conversations. Mahalo nui loa for joining us.